in a more natural way with less effort. And the same applies to language. Children can acquire any language without any effort. The analogy that I like to give is learning to walk, which is a little bit of a, well, it's the wrong expression, because children don't learn to walk. Children are not taught how to walk. When they're ready, they'll walk. And similarly, if children hear enough input in one language, two languages, three languages, they will learn them. And they will learn them without effort. So in this respect, there is a difference between learning a language when you're a child and learning a language when you're an adult. I'll come back to adult second language learning later on, and I'm not suggesting that you can't learn a foreign language well when you're an adult. I learned English when I was a late teenager. I'm not perfect, but I can express myself reasonably well. But languages are not learned with the same naturalness, with the same lack of effort as they're learned in children. And just in case you think that the brain is naturally monolingual, the human brain is geared, to learn only one language, well, there are very recent studies on the evolution of language in a broad sense. So where does language come from in the species? So going back a long time ago, apparently some suggestions are that the brain was originally multilingual, and being monolingual is a late specialization over the course of many hundreds, millions of years. So, bilingualism gives children a lot more than two languages. This is going to be my main theme. People tend to know a little bit more about social advantages. And of course, there is a social side to learning a language that is very important indeed. I'm not going to talk about the social side because my research is on the linguistic and the cognitive side, but you shouldn't think that I'm underestimating the importance of social factors. They're clearly very important, and they interact with linguistic and cognitive factors in very interesting ways. We know that there are social advantages such as access to two cultures. A child who learns two languages has the benefit of having access to two cultures, and that makes a bilingual child more tolerant, more interested towards other cultures. We know the instrumental benefits of bilingualism, such as, it's easier to travel, it may be easier to find a job later on, and so on. But what are the linguistic and cognitive benefits of bilingualism? This is an area where people know a lot less. And this is an area where I think people ought to know a lot more. So, for example, do bilingual children separate their two languages? I said before, this is a common fear in many parents, that their child is not going to speak any language properly. And later on, their child might have difficulty acquiring literacy in any language, well, proper literacy. Well, research shows that bilingual children can distinguish between their two languages from the very beginning of their lives. Some people actually claim that this ability to distinguish starts even in natal life. So if a child in the womb is exposed to two or more languages, something filters through. And so even newborns may be already primed to distinguish between the two languages. We also know, when we look at the development of languages in a bilingual child, that bilingual children follow the same sequence of stages, the same sequence of milestones as monolingual children, with some interesting differences, but the path seems to be largely the same in monolingual and in bilingual children. Now, whether this video will work, I'm not sure, because it was a bit erratic. So what do we see there first? We see babies. The baby on the left is wearing a cap. which attaches electrodes to the scalp, so we can measure the amount of electrical activity in the brain in response to given stimuli. So what happens in the brain if the baby hears sounds in one of their languages or in the other language? And we can measure that accurately by using these methods such as event-related potentials, one of the neurological methods. On the right, you see a slightly older child sitting on the parent's lap and watching, looking at a screen in front of them. So with methods like these, we can actually measure the patterns of eye movements, so where a child is looking. So the child sees images on the screen, and at the same time they hear sounds in either one language or the other language. And by looking at where they're looking on the screen and how long they look at particular images on the screen, we can actually tell whether they understand, how much they understand, whether they can distinguish between their two languages. Now this, if it works, the noise works. This is supposed to be, let me see if it works, a trilingual girl, Japanese, English, Czech. Nice combination of languages. And she's sitting on her mother's lap, and she's looking at a screen where she sees elephants and other animals. Now, what the researchers wanted to see is whether she uses three words for, well, she uses two words for elephant, effant and ele, because she can't pronounce elephant, it's too long. So we want to see whether she understands, you know, both elephant and effant and ele, or whether these words are just shortened in her production. Would be too good to be true. You can't see her face, unfortunately, it's too dark.
Elephant.
So,
where's the elephant?
Here.
Do you see it?
When she's asked where's the elephant, she knows, and she points at the elephant. Where's the ele?
Where's the ele? Do you see it?
Here.
Not really. Ele she uses, but she doesn't understand. Effant, even worse.
Where's the effant? Can you find it?
No clue of what an effant is, and she says it all the time. So clearly, you know, she knows that the correct form is elephant, but this is a production strategy. Just to give you a sample, you know, a little taster of what it means to do research with babies, and by using methods like these, which were largely unavailable until about 10, 15 years ago, now researchers know that even very young babies can distinguish between the two languages that they've heard, they've been exposed to, even when the two languages are very, very similar. So research done in Catalonia, in Barcelona, where many babies grow up with Spanish and Catalan. Spanish and Catalan are rather similar, but a 2-month-old baby can tell them apart. So no evidence of confusion between the two languages. And more recent studies actually show that babies use all kinds of cues to distinguish between languages, even facial expressions and mouth gestures. So for example, in this experiment, at 8 months, bilingual babies could distinguish between the two languages just by looking at silent faces. They didn't hear the languages, so no sound, but the same woman, you know, was moving her mouth and had different facial expressions when she was speaking one language and when she was speaking the other, and the baby knew which was which. So clearly babies are very sensitive to all kinds of cues. What about mixing the languages? Is this something to worry about? Well, children mix their languages a lot less than you think they are. Sometimes they mix languages deliberately. So There may be a word that the other language has that expresses the meaning they want to use, they want to convey. So they borrow that word from the other language. Sometimes bilingual children mix for fun, for particular effects. My children used to do this all the time. You know, they had a lovely repertoire of mixes between English and Italian that became family jokes. But even when children don't mix, they seem to be mixing for other reasons, this can hardly be seen as a sign of confusion. First of all, because adult bilinguals mix too. Remember that there are communities where mixing is perfectly acceptable. Again, every time I go to Catalonia, I'm amazed by the number of adult speakers who can switch from Spanish to Catalan. Pretty much, you know, all the time when they're speaking to other bilinguals. So this is one thing. Bilingual children tend to mix when they speak to other bilinguals, not when they're speaking to monolinguals, because they develop an early awareness that if they mix when they speak to monolinguals, they're not going to be understood. Also, there are lots of studies on how people mix. And mixing is not random. It has a precise grammar. You can only insert a word from the other language at certain points of the sentence, not at others. And so the rules, the grammar of mixing seems to be a part of being bilingual that bilingual children learn quite early on. Bilingual children have two languages in the same brain, obviously. And so they tend to notice how language works. I put notice in scare quotes because I don't mean that they know the grammatical rules and they can recite them. Of course not. They don't need that. They understand, they have a better awareness of the sounds, of the words, and of the sentences of language. They have a spontaneous understanding of how language, different linguistic system works, and they tend to compare them in their head, again, subconsciously, without being aware that they're doing that. So this seems to be one of the reasons why learning a third language or a fourth language later on is much easier for a bilingual child. So this implicit understanding of language helps them to accommodate other linguistic systems later on, to pick up other languages. For example, at the level of words, we know that, well, obviously bilingual children have two words for the same object. So my children had apple and mela for that thing over there. So because of this, bilingual children understand the conventional relationship between objects and words. So there's nothing inherently natural in calling that thing apple, because in fact, in a different language, you call it in a different way. Now, why is this an advantage? Why understanding this earlier is an advantage? Because all children, whether bilingual or monolingual, when they're very young, they tend to resist the idea that you can call the same thing in two different ways. So within the same language. So that thing over there is a dog, but it's also an animal, because animal is a superordinate category that includes dogs and horses and cats and so on. But for a young child, they tend to adopt the principle that it's only one label for each object. And they have to overcome that in order to learn the complexity of the vocabulary in each language. Bilingual children get there earlier because they already know that the same object can have two different labels across languages. And that speeds up the acquisition of vocabulary within each language.